Hey, so welcome back to my channel. I am Jason and this is from Sin's Perspective Reviews. So I just watched the first episode of Mrs. Scarlet and the Duke, and I must say I enjoyed the show. I knew I would because I love shows like this, but you know, let's get into this first episode. So it opens with this woman. She's walking down London Street. She's following this boy. He's clearly taking her somewhere. She makes it to the building. And he points in and she pays him, and she tells him to stay and watch. And so you see this woman, she's sprawled out dead, and she is like getting her, I guess, her kit out to collect evidence. And you know, she sees this false eye, this glass eye next to the woman. She picks up the eye and she tucks it into her the sleeve of her dress. And the next thing you know, this woman jumps up, puts her hand around this woman's neck, and they start tussling. She eventually tossed the woman to the side. And then she goes to the boy and say, the next time you tell me that there's a dead person, please check the pulse first, right? Drunk doesn't mean dead. So this woman was just drunk, passed out. Now, how drunk do you have to be to lose your eye, honey? I don't know. I mean, I've seen people drunk, but I've never seen people that drunk where you're leaving important things like that behind. Anywho, so she quickly left the situation. So she makes it home, and one of her servants, I think was it Miss Ivy, alerts her that you have a guest. And so she goes into the sitting room, and it's Mr. and Mrs. Parker. Mr. Parker is actually the son of Mrs. This is her son. And so they came to talk to her father about something. And she's telling him that, you know, her father's not there. And then the father, you know, his mother's going on about, you know, how a detective isn't, you know, a great profession for a gentleman. And, you know, how things have changed and how the streets aren't as safe as they used to be. And then they agreed that they would come back on Tuesday because Mr. Parker wanted to talk to her father and then eventually talk to her. So from that, we can deduce that he's going to ask her father permission to marry her. That's what you get from that. And so they left. And so after they left, Miss Ivy's in the kitchen trying to patch Miss Scarlet up, because when the woman grabbed her neck, she bruised her neck. And so she's trying to patch her up, and, you know, of course, Miss Ivy's trying to talk some sense into her, like, that's dangerous. I don't understand why you're doing this. And eventually one of the other servant, Kitty, I believe that's her name, walks in, and Miss Ivy starts asking her about the shopping, and was she able to get all the shopping done. And this is when they find out, Miss Scarlet finds out that they're in financial trouble, because she's saying that she tried to go to the butchers and to other places, but they wouldn't no longer extend them credit. They have to pay the balance what they owe before they will give them any more food products or whatever the case may be. And so, you know, she went to look for her father, and the undertaker came out, because the undertaker is right next to her dad's office, and they started talking. And, you know, he's the creepy, like you know, undertakers can be. And then she went on into the building. Her father is not there, and she has no idea where he could be. So she ends up going to the police station, and this is when we first meet William Duke, who is a Scotland Yard detective. She goes to the constabulary, and he's familiar with her. They have they've known each other for years, and he already know. You know that, you know, he knows her. And so she's talking to him about her dad and how he's, you know, how she can't find him. And of course he goes into how your father's a grown man, and, you know, her father is a detective. And so it's possible that he's just on a case, and it's not, you know, it's really not something that she should worry about, and how, you know, she should just go on home. And then, you know, they started talking, and he's telling her how he have all these cases that he needs to look at. And he's saying that detective work is for men, because he knows that she wants to be a detective, and he's like, detective work is for men. And then she said, so why are you doing it? Something, it was like a little snarky comment. It's just their relationship. They banter back and forth. And then he starts going in about these cases that he had. And it was one case where he was saying he found this man, his throat was slit, and you know, he's basically telling her that he has other things that he needs to focus on. So she's looking at the photos, and then he tells her those photos, you know, these things are not for women's eyes. You know, these are too harsh for the genteel sex. And then she starts telling him, just by the quick glance of looking at some of the photos, that she saw that it looks like on his feet there's like this syphilitic wound, and starts, you know, going into details about how the body, and maybe I would suggest maybe a possible lover or even his wife, but I'm sure you already thought of that. And he's like, well, yeah, we did. And so she's like, okay, well, you know, I'm going to, she decided she was going to go in on and leave. So after she left, he called one of the officers in and told him to bring the wife in. So obviously he didn't think about that, but he took that information that she gave him and used it. Okay. So Scarlet makes it home, and I believe it was Kitty that said, oh, your father, you know, your father's in the sitting room. And so she went in, and he had him laid out on the couch. And she was, you know, thought that he was drunk, that he just drunk until he passed out. And the doctor was there also and said that, basically, you know, no, he's not sleeping. I'm sorry to have to tell you that he's dead. Apparently he had a heart attack at some point, and they found him in the streets and brought him home. And so, of course, she was quite devastated. And next thing you know, you see you there at the funeral, and William is, you know, after the ceremony, William is talking to her and just basically talking about how he's always respected her father, and how much he knew how much her father loved her mother, and you know, just I guess he felt like I think you should probably think of it as them being, you know, finally being reunited. But then she got emotional and like, you know, basically I'm alone now. So apparently she's an only child, and now both her parents are gone. And, you know, her father has kind of left them in this financially, you know, precarious situation. So it's like, okay, what am I going to do? So she's home grieving, and I don't remember if it was Ivy or Kitty that came in and said that she had a visitor, and the person was Alfred Winters. And he's going off because he's saying that he had an appointment with her father, and how he wasn't at his office, and I see he's not here either. And she didn't tell him that her father had passed. She basically said, oh, you know, he's been working on this huge case for the government, and, you know, and he's been keeping him busy, but I can take, you know, notes and pass your notes on to him. And then, you know, initially he was like, well, I don't really feel comfortable talking about the details of my story with the woman. And she, you know, basically said that, you know, I'll just take things down and I'll make sure that I pass it on to him and he contacts you. And so he tells, you know, goes into how his health is poor and how he doesn't have long to live. And he had a falling out with his niece, Carla Sims. And, you know, it was over her husband, how he never, you know, liked her husband. And, you know, eventually she knew that. And so she ends up eloping with this guy. And, you know, he hasn't seen her since. And so he wants to reconnect with her before he dies. Okay. And so he got upset, and because she said that must have been very difficult for you. And he jumps up and says, this is why he didn't want to talk to a woman, because a man would never respond that way. And tell your uncle that I'm going to be at ABC, this particular hotel. And he left, just like, ugh, okay. So, I mean, I have to admit that there are a few times where you get hot under your collar watching this show a little bit, but okay. So, she ends up having a flashback of her dad and how he would do these experiments, and he would include her and he would educate her, and he knew you know, about her love for detective work and the whole thing. And so he would, you know, like educate her, like this particular experiment. They had a frog in a jar, and it, I think it had chloroform on the rag that was on top of the jar, and he was asking her like, what are the effects of chloroform? And then he, you know, asked her about laudanum and arsenic and all these other poisons. And he was, you know, happy that she was quite knowledgeable about those things. Okay, so she ends up calling, no, actually Kitty came in and told her that dinner was ready. and she asked Kitty to get her a cab. Now the sun is going down, and they're telling her, you know, it's understood at this time, this is Victoria, England, that women out after a certain time unaccompanied are pretty much seen as loose or prostitutes or whatever the case may be. So they're telling her that, you know, the sun is going down and it's not appropriate for you to be out on your own. It's dangerous. And, you know, eventually Ivy comes in to tell her, you know, the dinner's ready, and now she's trying to talk her, you know, out of not going. And eventually she said, you know what, I'll get my own cab. Okay, so Carla, she's standing. I don't know if she was just waiting for one of the young guys that I guess that does work for her, and he took her to this panhandler, and she was asking him about Carla Sims, and she threw some money in his little hat and said, you know, I would say ask Moses, always ask Moses. And because the guy, when he was standing there and he had the Bible in his hand, he was telling people to repent and all this kind of stuff. And so initially I was like, okay, what is he? Did he just like goop her or get her money, whatever? And so she walked off, and then you know, she's in this establishment where things go on. You know, you got some, you know, scantily clad women, and you got the women up on the thing dancing, and she see a woman standing at the bar, and she goes over to talk to the woman. The woman turns around. This woman has an eye patch. So this is the woman who she thought was dead, and apparently she don't have her eye. So, okay. And the reason we know that she doesn't have the eye, and now that I think back on it, is when, excuse me, when Scarlet was sitting talking to the Parkers, when she reached out to pour the tea, the eye fell out of her sleeve, and they kind of was like, okay, what in the world does she got going on over there? Okay, so Scarlet goes over to talk to the woman, and the woman was asking her, like, you look familiar. Have we met before? And Scarlet was like, oh, no, we've never met before. And the woman was like, I never forget a face, right? And so she was like, well, that's good. Because so then she held up a photo of Carla Sims and asked her if she looked familiar. And she told her no, but she was like, you should ask Moses. And Moses was the guy on the second floor trying to get the women, make sure the women were, you know, where they're supposed to be and getting them together. So she ends up going on to the second floor. And she goes into the office and she finds Moses, and she starts asking about Carla. And she told him that she was a detective, and he laughed her off and basically said that you know, it's my job to protect these women. I don't have time for some whore with flights to fancy or something, he said. And so she was like, well, maybe I can make it worth your while. And she pulled out her coin purse and said that she would pay him for his information. So he came over, she paid him, and then he snatched her coin, the entire purse. And so she told him that, you know, he need to give her her coin purse back. And she was like, maybe we can make a deal. And he was like, well, no offense, but you're not my type. You're too skinny. And so she was like, well, let me show you what a skinny woman can do. And so once she got close enough to him, she handcuffed him to some railing or something. And he basically threatened her. So she looked over and she saw this bottle of this jar of turpentine. And of course, that with the kerosene lamp, she basically told him that if he didn't give her back her coin purse, she was going to set his ass on fire. And he relented. He threw it over to her. And then he told her that when he found her, he was going to kill her. And she was like, you're too drunk to even look for anybody. And so he kind of chuckled a little bit. And he was like, you know what? I like you. And then she asked him about Carla. And basically told him that if he didn't give her the information that she wanted, that she was going to burn the whole place down. So the next thing you know, we see Carla and okay, so Scarlet found Carla. She was in some show where she was up against this wall and this man was throwing knives. And he was trying to get as close as possible to her without actually hitting her. And he got a little too close for comfort. So it ended, and she kind of like jacked him up a little bit, basically telling him that he needed to do better, you know, that he was, you know, got too close to her. And then she was walking away. Scarlet called her name. and told her that her uncle was looking for her. And so they sat and talked for a while. And next thing you know, the place got raided. The cops came in. They're calling all the women whores and how they spread disease and this whole thing. They grabbed Sims. They grabbed Scarlet. Sims knew what was going to happen, so she ended up kneeing one of the cops and ran away. They dragged Scarlet into this room with this exam table, and they was about to get all up in her skirt to see if she could have any STDs. But then she told him that she was friends with, or she made it seem like she was the side chick or had some kind of romantic relationship with William Dukes, who is a detective for Scotland Yard, and if they you know, proceeded, they would be held to pay. So the next thing you know, she's sitting in his office, all disheveled and, you know, all looking all accosted and everything else, right? And he was like, huh, so you told them basically that you were my whore. So now you got people thinking that I'm some whoremonger. And so she said, well, I can't imagine that's going to hurt your reputation much. Something to that effect. And he was like, well, speaking of reputations, yours is hanging by a thread. And so they talked a little bit. And he started to they started walking down the hall, and she was talking about how when he kissed her and how he took advantage of her or something. And he was like, I was 19 and she was 6. He was like, I was 19 and you were 16 and your poodle had just died. And so she thought that he was walking her out, but he went into another direction. She was like, wait a minute, that's not the way out. And so next thing you know, you hear the bars close, and he locked her in the cell for the night to keep her out of trouble. So the following morning, when she was released, she went to the hotel to talk to Mr. Winters. And when he saw her, he was like, well, I didn't expect to see you. And she said, well, you know, I told, you know, my father, but he's still quite busy. And he was like, well, no, I didn't expect to see you because I saw the paper this morning and I saw that he had died. And he basically said that he's going to go to Gill and Sons. And she basically told him they're just going to run the clock. They going to pretend to do all this work. They're not going to do anything, and they're basically going to rip you off. And he was like, well, how is that any different than the stunt you pulled? And then she says that your niece has 2 different color eyes, right? That wasn't a detail that you gave me. And he, you know, was happy. He was like, so you know where she is? And he was like, I will bring her to you, but I want 50% up front and 50% upon delivery. And he paid her. And so the next thing we see is Scarlet going to meet Carla. And they talked, and she basically said that she wanted to meet with her uncle, but she said, well, you can't meet him looking like this. This is Scarlet. So she took Scarlet back to her house, took Sims back to her house to get her, to fix her hair and all that. And so Sims was talking about how things ended with her uncle, how, you know, her uncle was right, and how, you know, her husband was only after her for her money. And, you know, he just wasn't a good guy, but how it wasn't all his fault because he had lost his first wife in a tragic accident when a steamer sank, his wife drowned, and, you know, the whole thing. So now there's a knock at the door, and she turns to meet her uncle, and her entire demeanor changed. And she says to Scarlet, that's not my uncle, that's my husband. And so he peeled off all the fake facial hairs, and he, you know, started telling her how her uncle had died a couple of weeks ago, and how he wished he was there, and now, you know, he has control over her money. And she's basically said that was my money. And of course, during this time, women couldn't inherit property. Everything went to their husbands. And he basically, because he wanted her money, but obviously he didn't want her. So he basically filed this false claim saying that she was morally, something has to do with moral insanity. And he basically told the story how she left him to be a whore, a prostitute. And so when he came to meet with her, he already had 2 guys there who basically dragged her off to an institution. And so Scarlet is upset. She's telling Carla that she's going to get her out, and he ends up telling her that the only person that can get her out is me, and basically he has no intention of doing that. And he gave her the remaining 50% just to rub it in, right? And so Scarlet is obviously upset, and there's a flashback of her and her dad. She clearly had gotten into a fight, and she was saying how, you know, after she told them that she wanted to be a police officer, that they told her that she would always be a motherless pig or something. And he basically, the father started blaming himself, like, it's my fault for basically indulging these fantasies that you have, and it's time for you to understand how the world works and how women don't have the same opportunities as men, and it's time for you to grow up. And it was a not so pleasant conversation for her. So then she went over to speak to Duke. He's upset. He was upset that she had put herself in harm's way. He's saying that Sims is a career criminal, but that, you know, they haven't been able to find anything to stick to him. And now that he has inherited her, he has her wealth, he's now a wealthy landowner, and they're really not going to do much to him. I mean, you know, at this point. And so he was quite upset. He tells her, this is what happens when women dabble in men's affairs. Like I said, yeah, there are quite a few situations there where you get hot under your collar, but you know, the nonsense. But anywho, so she basically said, you know, I apologize for involving you in my stupidity, and I'm only a woman after all. Like, she's like playing the game with him, right? And then she, you know, used her feminine wiles, and she made, you know, pretended like she felt faint and she needed some salts, and he went to get her for her. And what she really wanted, obviously, was him to get out of the office so she can get that file, get Sim's file. And she ducked out. So she's now at her father's detective agency, and you hear Duke banging on the door, but telling her she needs to open the door. And so she's going through the files, and something clicked. So she ends up going to, you flash to Mr. Sims, he's in his hotel room, and he is packing. So she walked in, and he asked her, well, how did you get in? And she's like, oh, I got the key from the maid. And so he goes, well, you know, that's not a problem. I'll just call the manager. And so she was like, well, who do you think told her to give me the key? Basically, I told him that if he didn't give me the key, that I was going to tell his wife that him and the maid were having an affair. And from there, how they were interacting, you can kind of tell there was something between them. And so he thought, you know what, it would just, you know, go on and give her the key and let her in the room. Then she started asking him questions about the steamer sinking and his first wife. And then she produced an article that basically lists the survivors. And wouldn't you know, his first wife is listed as a survivor. So his first wife is very much alive. He was still legally married to her, which makes his marriage to Clara null and void. He's a bigamist. So... And then you see him grab this material and he's wrapping it around his hand like he's about to strangle her. And he asking her like, well, who else did you tell about this your fairy tale story or something to that effect? And she tried to make it seem like the cops were in the lobby. But he called her bluff. He knew that she realized that she was making that up. And then she said, you know, it's interesting. You know, I find it interesting that you chose strangulation, seeing as how you're getting weaker by the moment. And he was like, what are you talking about? He said, oh, well, before the maid gave me the keys, she also allowed me to make it was a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And, you know, it was kind of difficult to calculate the amount of laudanum I would need to put in here to incapacitate a man of your size. And so before you know it, he started feeling dizzy and he collapsed. And so the next thing you know, she's in a carriage and they have him in handcuffs. And Duke is telling her that the next time you steal police evidence or you poison someone, I won't have any choice but to lock you up. And she was like, oh, it's just a little bit of laudanum. He was like, the man was out for over an hour. And so she thanked him, obviously, for not throwing her in jail. So after she left, you know, she went to the institution, I guess it was, to make sure that they let Carla go. So she went home, and Kitty or Miss Ivy? Miss Ivy met her at the door and told her she had a visitor. It was Mr. Parker, and he was there to propose to her. But then he basically said that he chose not to propose to her. He said that, you know, my mom wanted me to propose to you. She knew that other women would say no, but she knew that because of his words were financial insecurities, that you would most likely say yes. And of course that offended her, like, oh, okay, so I'll be so desperate and harder for a man that I would just, the fact that you had money, I would just say yes. But, you know, he doesn't feel that way about her. He holds her in high regard. The thing is, he feels like he hasn't had enough time, he hasn't had a chance to live his own life. He's saying that there's still a lot of things that he wants to do, a lot of things that he wants to experience, and he's just not ready to marry. And he's like, oh, mom's going to be so angry. And so she told him, you know what, you could just tell her that it was my idea. And he said, you would do that for me? She was like, sure. He said, you know, he thanked her. But she did say that, I wish I could be there to see her face. And so they had a little chuckle over that. But then he told her that, you know, if there's anything that she ever needs, that, you know, don't hesitate to call. So, you know, that was nice. So she's at the office, and Duke arrived, and they go inside. And he actually asked her about the sign because it still has her father's name up there. And she was like, well, if I put a miss up there, nobody's going to take it serious. So she basically left her father's name up there. They go inside and talk, and you realize that she has some new furniture, new desks, new curtains, and the whole thing. And she was like, oh, yes, I have an investor. And then they talked a little bit, and then she asked him for an update on the case about the man whose throat was slit. And he said, well, it was the wife. She was like, oh, really, was it? Imagine that, right? And so they talked a little bit, and then she basically said that if there's any time that you need help on the case, let me know. And of course, he's like, okay, you know, well, you have a good day. And he went on and left. And so next thing you know, you hear a voice saying, so you're really going to do this, aren't you? So she turned around and she see her father, and he's sitting in his chair. And she was like, well, what, you don't think I should? And he said, well, what does it matter what I think? You wouldn't listen anyway. And they talked for a little while, and then he pointed out on the wall there was a photo that was crooked. And so she went over to straighten the photo. And of course, by the time she turned around, he was gone. And she went and sat behind her new desk. And that was pretty much how this episode ended. I mean, it was a great, good episode. It didn't feel like it was 52 minutes, because I guess maybe because it was so entertaining, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to continue to watch the rest of the episode. So I'm going to end this here, and I will talk to you guys later.